Hello and welcome to Varrostories. In this video I will tell you about the cozy horror story, The Whispers of Oak Hollow. When Isabel rented the old cottage in Oak Hollow, she believed it would be her sanctuary, a peaceful retreat far from the noise and chaos of her busy life. The pressures of city living had drained her, and she yearned for solitude and tranquility in nature's embrace. The cottage, nestled on the edge of a dense, ancient forest, seemed to promise just that. Its weathered stone walls were cloaked in ivy that crawled like fingers over the surface, and its isolation offered a sense of security from the prying eyes of the world. The villagers rarely spoke of the place, and when they did, their words were cautious and laced with an unsettling undertone. But Isabel, a woman who had little use for superstition or old tales, paid no heed. She simply craved peace. In the early days, the cottage fulfilled her every expectation. Each morning, she would wander through the overgrown forest paths, collecting wildflowers and breathing in the crisp, clean air. The sun would filter through the dense canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground as she sat by the towering oaks, feeling a quiet sense of connection to the earth beneath her. The serenity she had longed for was here, in abundance. As evening fell, she would curl up by the hearth with a good book, a steaming cup of tea, and nothing but the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the call of distant birds, the crackling of the fire, to fill the silence. No phones, no emails, no responsibilities. Just stillness. But as the days wore on, a subtle unease began to creep into her peaceful refuge. It was nothing she could put her finger on at first, a fleeting chill that ran up her spine for no reason, or a slight heaviness in the air that seemed to follow her from room to room. On the fourth night, the first whisper came. It was faint at first, little more than a murmur, but it persisted. A soft, insistent sound, as though someone was trying to communicate. Isabel dismissed it as the house settling, the wind whispering through cracks in the stone walls. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer random or distant but seemed to come from within the walls themselves, winding their way through the old structure with an urgency she could not ignore. They were foreign to her, no language she knew, just an eerie cadence that felt like it was calling to her. One evening, as the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the room, Isabel pressed her ear to the cold stone of the cottage, straining to hear. The whispers were now unmistakably clear, though their meaning remained elusive. There was an intensity to them, a tone of pleading, as though something, or someone, was desperate for her attention. The next morning, feeling a growing sense of dread, Isabel ventured to the village inn, hoping to find some answers. Ethel, the elderly innkeeper, greeted her with a knowing look when she mentioned the cottage. "You've been staying there?" Ethel asked, her voice quivering slightly, her eyes widening as if she had just heard something dangerous. Isabel nodded. "It's been beautiful, really. Peaceful. But lately, something strange has been happening. I keep hearing whispers coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but now it feels different." Ethel's face went pale, her fingers trembling as she reached for a mug of tea. She looked around the inn, as though afraid of being overheard, and then lowered her voice. "Well, it's not a place that welcomes strangers. Not anymore." Isabel frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethel hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the mist creeping over the village streets outside. "There was a woman who used to live there. Mara. She spoke to things in the forest. Things that weren't human. People started hearing voices. Seeing things that shouldn't be seen. And the forest, it doesn't forget." Isabel chuckled nervously, but the sound was hollow in her own ears. "You mean to say it's haunted?" "No," Ethel whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "Not haunted. But Mara made a bargain. With them. The things in the forest. She vanished one night, just disappeared. No one saw her go. The cottage has been empty ever since." Isabel's skepticism flared, but a flicker of unease wormed its way into her chest. Just a story, I'm sure. Ethel didn't respond, but she turned toward the window, staring out into the gray mist that had already begun to blanket the village streets. That night, Isabel's fears turned to reality. The whispers returned, louder, clearer. And now, they were calling her name. Isabel. Isabel. It was a soft, beckoning sound, intoxicating and filled with something dark, something ancient. Compelled by a force she could not explain, Isabel followed the sound. She traced it through the darkened house until it led her to the hearth. The whispers, now almost frantic, seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. Her heart pounded as she pried up a loose board near the fire. Beneath it, she found a small, dust-covered box. Her curiosity overwhelmed her caution, and she opened it. Inside, a single sheet of yellowed parchment lay crumpled and brittle. It was covered in strange symbols, looping, twisting marks that seemed to pulse and shift as though they were alive. As she touched the paper, a sharp chill swept through her, and the whispers erupted into 1,000 voices, screaming, pleading, rising in a cacophony of sound that reverberated in her skull. The temperature dropped in an instant, and her breath formed mist in front of her face. For a split second, she thought she saw something in the shadows, a shape, dark and stretching unnaturally toward her. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The windows rattled, and the room seemed to tighten around her. The fire sputtered, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and danced on the walls. A low, guttural growl echoed from the corners of the room, and the walls began to pulse, as if they were alive. Frozen in terror, Isabel tried to move, but her limbs refused to obey. The whispers had become desperate, now sounding like agonized cries, like something, or someone, was trapped, begging for release. "Help, help us, please help." Clutching the parchment to her chest, Isabel felt a searing heat pulse through her body. It burned her skin, leaving blisters in its wake. She dropped the paper in agony and stumbled toward the door. The handle wouldn't turn. The cottage had trapped her inside. The shadows grew bolder, swirling around her like a living thing. They coalesced into monstrous shapes, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim firelight. Their mouths opened in unison, whispering one word, over and over, until it became a sickening chant. "Join us, join us." Isabel backed against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind unraveling. The whispers had become physical, tightening around her like chains, squeezing the very essence of her being. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it was no use. The voices drilled into her mind, louder and more insistent. Her sanity was slipping away. Then, through the madness, she saw her. Mara. The woman from the stories. Mara stood in the center of the room, her eyes black as night, her smile stretched too wide, twisted and cruel. Her voice joined the chorus of whispers, soft and mocking. "You came for peace, didn't you?" she purred, her voice dripping with venom. "You wanted to escape the world, to hide. But the forest, it doesn't let go." Isabel's legs gave way beneath her, and she was pulled toward the center of the room by cold, skeletal hands that wrapped around her limbs, tightening, binding her in place. The shadows closed in, their whispers suffocating her thoughts. "No!" Isabel screamed, her voice barely a whisper above the deafening cries. "I just wanted peace. I just wanted to be alone. Please." Mara's laughter filled the room, bitter and cruel. "Peace is a lie," she hissed. "The forest never lets go." The darkness consumed her then. And everything went silent. The next morning, Ethel and her husband went to check on Isabel. When they reached the cottage, they found the door standing wide open. The fire was long extinguished, the house eerily silent. It was as if Isabel had never been there at all. The villagers knew the stories. They knew that once the forest claimed someone, it would never truly let them go. They put up warnings around the cottage, cautioning others to stay away. The whispers had faded, but the darkness still lingered, waiting. And so, the cottage stood empty, its ivy-clad walls a silent reminder of the cursed bargain made so long ago. Time passed, but Oak Hollow's secrets remained, buried deep in the shadows of the forest, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to seek solace in its grasp.